3, 2, 1, and we are live. Whenever you are, wherever you are, thank you for joining the Design of Everyday People, where I talk to senior designers from all over the world and where you get to ask them literally anything. So stick around to the end where you get your questions answered. Let's start by making this session interactive and drop a emoji, a comment. Where are you tuning in from? I know there's a bit of a lag, but I'll try and bring you guys on screen when those emojis or city names or country names are coming in. And if you're struggling with the stream, because I know this has happened in the past, I will drop a link to the YouTube. So if you're watching on LinkedIn, feel free to jump over to YouTube for a more stable stream. And one more thing before we get started in this conversation, I just want to say UX Playbook is having our Black Friday sale. It has officially started today. So today you can get 40% off. You can get resources from everything you need playbook wise to build your better portfolio, step-by-step guides for any UX project, courses on how to stand out in your job search, and even tactics and strategies to lead your first design team. So get 40% off. Let me bring up the code if I have it here by scanning this QR code. Does it work? Yeah, the one in the corner or the one down here that I'm just about to get on screen. Scan that QR code or visit uxplaybook.org and enter the code FRIYAY24 for 40% off. Okay, that's enough of me shilling. Let's get back to the show. So welcome to How Designers Manage Up. Yeah, again, you can find everything here. And let's start with introductions. If you don't know who I am, I'm Chris, the founder of UX Playbook. I spend most of my time helping designers navigate a fuzzy UX career. But that's enough about me. Today, we are joined by Sally Carson, a design executive leading teams at LinkedIn, Cisco, ex-founder and CEO, a solopreneur, and a very talented illustrator. So let's get her out and find out more about Sally. Sally, how are you doing?
Hey, Chris. Hey, everybody. I'm doing great.
Awesome. I know it's really early for you, so I appreciate you jumping on, 9 a.m.-ish your time. So
All
for
good.
the audience that doesn't know Sally, can you give us a little background and tell us about yourself?
Yeah, sure. And I'm so excited to have this chat today. I'm a designer that's been working in tech for nearly 25 years. So I'm like a tech elder at this point. The first 10 years of my career, I was an individual contributor designer. The more recent 15 years, I've been in leadership roles. And I'll talk a little bit about what I've been up to there. But I think I learned a lot once I stepped into leadership about what I was doing wrong as an IC the 10 years prior. And it was like a little bit like embarrassing. I'm like, oh my gosh, I could have played that so much more strategically. So that's a lot of what I like to focus on is like, what would I like to have been able to tell baby Sally back in the day so she could not stall out her career and be a little bit more effective. Let's see. So I've worked at Yahoo way back when. I was freelance for a bit and working with folks like 23andMe and Splunk and lynda.com before LinkedIn acquired them. More recently in leadership, I think my CEO co-founder role as a startup, that was like my first entrance into leading teams. And I raised venture capital and we did RGA Techstars Accelerator. So that was like a huge learning curve for me. It was my first time stepping into leadership. I think I had a good heart. I had good intentions, but I had no leadership chops at all. I was like leading a company, but I hadn't actually done anything in the way of like developing my management style or my leadership style. And then after I left my startup, I joined Duo Security to build out their product design and user research function and led that org for the next 6 years and built it like from 0 to about 45 or 50 people by the time I left and got a ton of awesome mentorship. Like my boss, Chester, there at Duo was an amazing mentor to me. And so a lot of the things that you hear me say about leadership and management, it's coming originally from Chester. So I'm sort of like spreading all the good information that he gave me. And it meant a lot to be in an organization that took leadership seriously, that really invested in managers and making sure managers were effective. And then Cisco bought Duo, and I went on to become the head of design for Cisco security, which is interesting. I had a tiny little team. It was like 3 or 4 people, but our scope of influence was an 8,000 person org. And Cisco had grown through like over 200 acquisitions. And like, how do you take dozens of design systems, dozens of UXR teams, personas, and try to consolidate it so we're all like working against like a cohesive vision? Really challenging organizationally, but again, learned a lot. And then more recently, led design for LinkedIn Jobs. And that was really fun because it spanned consumer, B2B. It's a two-sided marketplace. We're building stuff that folks on the call might be familiar with, tools like the hashtag hiring frame and partnering with other teams to work on the open to work frame that you see on people's profiles. And just building out product for job seekers who are looking for work, for hiring managers and recruiters who are looking to hire. And I loved it. Like I loved getting to drop into a mature, large design organization that's been around for maybe nearly a couple decades and just see like how are they running programs? What does a super mature, robust user research practice look like that many years later? So I feel really fortunate. It's been amazing to be able to do like early stage startup as a leader, 0 to 10 employees. Duo, I was there for sort of like 100 to 1,000 employees as we went through hypergrowth, dropping into Cisco with tens of thousands of employees, and then my scope of impact being like 8,000-ish and beyond. And then to LinkedIn, where it's like the design team itself at the time was like over between 200 and 300 people at LinkedIn, and they were much further along in terms of their maturity. Cisco's less matured in terms of a design org, but that company's been around since the 90s, so that's interesting too. So just like taking lessons all along the way about like what's different about this environment, what works in this environment. And I recommend designers do that, kind of like take from the buffet of different types of organizational environments to see what's a fit for your disposition.
Yeah. Like absolutely awesome career, Sally. So there's so
Thanks.
much we could like dive into, and I think this would
Yeah.
be really beneficial for folks who maybe are early in their career or just a couple of years in, even later in their career, not like seeing through your eyes of like different types of org and different types of
Mm-hmm.
ways to sort of navigate the minefield of complex org structures, right?
Yeah.
But before we start there, I do want to again remind folks that we will be addressing some of your questions at the tail end of this. So please, as we speak, if something comes up, drop those in the comments and we'll try and answer them to the best of our abilities. So why don't we start? You mentioned you've played the founder role and then kind of moving up into the different size of orgs. Maybe I just will start with a much broader question here
Yeah.
on topic, which is how is there difference between managing up in different size of orgs? Like how do you
Yeah.
kind of like look at that?
Oh, that's such a good question. I don't think anybody's asked me that before. Yeah, and I think part of my role as a leader, and I wish great leaders, I think, um, I'm not calling myself a great leader, but when I see like effective leadership, this is like one of the many things that they do, and one of the things that I had to learn. Um, like effective leaders help the team, help you as a designer make sense of what's happening in the org. And I'll give Duo as an example. Like maybe in that first year, maybe the first year and a half, I had to build the team up to about 10 designers. And at that point, it was kind of like, I would call it like a consensus culture. Like everybody on my team, we could sit around in one room and be like, what do you think we should do for design systems? Is that what we should do? Yeah, feels good. Everybody's good. All right, cool. And decisions were very much made on consensus. It was super transparent. It was very real time. It was very rapid. And I'll come back around to your question about managing up too, but I'm kind of explaining like how context can change even at the same org.
Sure.
By the time the team was like 25 people a few years in, and maybe I had like a layer or two of management underneath me, that just doesn't scale. It's like, it just doesn't make sense. You can't physically sit in a room with 25 people. You can't possibly be like, what do you think we should do? Yeah, feels good, in like an hour-long meeting. It's just not possible. And I think sometimes designers, that shift. So I was like helping the team make sense of like, we are in the process of shifting from consensus to alignment. Like now we're in this like alignment phase where there's smaller pods of people working together. They have their own sense of like autonomy, and they can do consensus at that smaller pod or triad level. And then they can bubble that up to make sure that all the like teams are aligned with each other. But that alone is a shift. And I think a lot of designers misunderstand that shift from consensus to alignment as like, my boss is a bad actor. Now there's all this top-down decision making. They're hoarding information. They're hiding information. That happens too sometimes. But there's just organizational realities when things get larger where decision making has to be made in a different way. Information has to get cascaded in a different way. And similarly, like early baby design team, 10 people, hopefully you've got like a really good rapport with your manager. You get a lot of time with them. It's all about that one-on-one relationship and building the foundation of trust in both directions. And you can communicate, pretty regularly. Hopefully you're having weekly one-on-ones with them. There's just like a really open line of communication. And especially if they're like head of, even if it's a relatively small team, but once you're in that like bigger organization with layers of management, that starts to look quite different because you need to like managing up in the small team is kind of like it's the one-on-one relationship with your manager. But in that larger org, you need to think about like, how do I cascade information upward? Like there might be a manager of your manager who's still within the design org, and you need to be thinking about those layers and levels. And hopefully you're also having occasional skip level meetings, but it's also like, how do I equip my manager with the information they need to manage up to their manager and beyond?
Yeah, I've never actually thought about that concept of like helping your manager manage up and maybe their manager
Yeah.
also managing up, depending on how critical the information or how much influence you have upwards.
Yes.
That's crazy. I've never thought about it like that.
And
Okay.
everybody has a boss. If you go up, like even at that startup, like I was the CEO, but essentially my bosses I was on a board that had external board members, not just my co-founder, but investors. And then your bosses are kind of your investors, which is interesting. You're like, I'm a designer. I want my bosses to be my customers. Like we need to serve the customer. But really, like your investor is giving you money and you're accountable to them and you're accountable to your board. And then your investors have bosses, like VC firms have limited partners, LPs that they're reporting up to, and on up the chain. So the more that you can understand, like, what kind of business are you working in? Is it private? Is it public? Is it an early stage startup? Is it growth stage? Is it mature? How does the company make money, basically? And that will really drive the dynamics and the decision making that you're seeing on the leadership level.
Yeah, and I mean, I think this is a good segue into like folks in the IC role versus folks in a leadership role have sort of, I guess, two broad bucket personas where they're managing up to. One IC, you might be managing, like you might be like your boss might be another designer or someone at least more design fluent. Whereas in leadership role,
Right.
it's almost always like a business person or
Uh-huh.
like a more not a designer basically, right?
Yeah.
Depending on orgs, but let's just like broad stroke it. um can you talk about a bit about like the sort of like IC managing up and maybe leadership managing up and what your experience was from the different shifts and perspectives?
Yeah. So an IC managing up to a design manager versus a design leader or design executive managing up to a non-design executive
Yeah.
potentially. Yeah, the former might be more familiar to folks because that's probably what a lot of the folks on the call are doing. And I'm happy to dive into like techniques around how do you manage up to your design manager boss effectively.
Yep.
Maybe it's a little bit interesting to hear about like being a design exec reporting to someone who's not a designer, because I've done that. Like I was reporting to a VP of Eng at Duo, which was interesting to be inside Eng. I actually liked it. I hear people like poo-poo that approach, but Eng gets budget and I had a great boss. So I was like, I'm happy. This is working. And then by the time I left Cisco, I was reporting to the chief strategy officer, who was very design sympathetic. Like he was the one that brought me into that role. And he was the former CEO of Duo, so I already had credibility. But I was working with a lot of execs, senior execs at Cisco, who it was kind of their first contact with design, or maybe even worse, they'd been working with design for a long time, but it was very purely superficial, surface layer, no knowledge of like how to help influence product strategy by way of user research and design. And that's like a slog, I'll be honest. Like that situation is so challenging, especially if there's not an appetite. If they're not like, teach us how to do it, like what we want to learn. If they're like, we already know what this is, but their notion of it is not your understanding of what design can be. And again, like for me personally, it all starts with like building relationships, building trust, and really like beyond trust, like building credibility. and aligning with your partners on like, what are they being measured by? What are they on the hook to deliver to the business? And how can you help support them? And in an org like that, it's also helpful to realize like, is this a more engineering led organization? Is it sales led? Is it product led? And working with your leaders to kind of understand those high level dynamics about like, what are the departments and disciplines that have a ton of influence here that influence the way that we build product? Because if it's a product led org, there's so many like great opportunities for design to add value, right? Because the more senior you become as a designer or researcher, you're starting to encroach on PM work essentially. And if you have the trust and partnership of your product partners, you can basically start to take work off their plate and be like, oh, you're doing customer discovery. Let me run those interviews for you because you're slammed over here. Like PMs are always slammed. So if they have trust in you and you're partnering with them to either, co-create work or just fully take work off their plate, and then they can be the consumer of the synthesis of the research, that's awesome, right? And then you can leverage PM to start singing your praises, like, hey, we need design here. That's always more effective. Like instead of designers being like, we need a seat at the table, like build credibility with your cross-functional partners who have a ton of influence and have them being like, we really need design here. They're so helpful.
Yeah. Do you
I
think
don't know
that
if I even answered your question. Did I take it? I think I took it in a totally different direction. Sorry.
that's no, all good, because it's triggering some other thoughts. So I like
Okay.
that we're free flowing. So is that the best tactic, do you think? Like, or like at least one of like the top three, where it's like just help other folks do work that they're existingly doing and take things off their plate as a designer? Because I mean, we
Yeah.
have we do a wide array of things, right? And we
Right.
have
Yeah.
the capacity to do that. Do you think that's one of the best tactics, that you're just like, just add value to that person or that org, and eventually, you'll build credibility and trust, and what you say will hopefully matter?
Yeah, and not in a passive way, but I think it's a good start. It's a good start to building a new working relationship is like, hey, I'm here to partner with you. I want to add value. Let's align on what both of our goals are. Hopefully they're pretty similar if you're on a triad together. I generally, unless you're working on a design system or design ops or something, I'm kind of anti-design having its own OKRs. They're totally separate from the product org or Eng org, for example. Eng, it makes sense, right? It's like they're doing code base oriented stuff that's more internal. But product and design on goals should be very tightly aligned. And I always talk about with like a manager IC relationship, the direct report relationship, forming a trusted partnership. And I think it's true for cross-functional peers too. I was at times like this. I see so many designers who do this. They form a combative relationship with people who are key partners.
I've done
because
it.
they get kind of, like designers, me included, get a little dogmatic about like, we're not doing it the right way. It should be this way. Like we're in this part of the double diamond and we need to be on this step and we're not on this step and you're jumping ahead, or, like check your dogma, be realistic, because it's just not going to land well. Like you will come to be known as someone who is kind of obnoxious, honestly. Like I think I was obnoxious early on when I was doing that stuff. And technically on paper, if I was like writing a book about process, maybe I was correct. But situationally, I was incorrect because no one was interested in what I was talking about. They were actually like doing fine before I got in there and was like, we need to change this for process. So really like, I want to encourage folks to build their self-awareness at work and build your organizational awareness. And if you're hammering on some idea that people are just not hungry for whatsoever, and you're getting frustrated, my like TLDR is like, save your energy. Like work on things where you do have influence, work on things where people are like, this is awesome. Thank you. We're partnering on this. And it's kind of ironic, right? Because, and I hope people don't feel like I'm like badgering them, like being too harsh, but honestly, this is like what I wish I knew. Like the irony is we're so customer oriented, like designers, it's like one of our core skills is empathy, understanding the needs, motivations, and goals of the customer, using that as a frame through which we make all of our decisions. And yet we don't do that with our colleagues or our manager sometimes. It's more like antagonistic and who's going to win. And maybe some of that's the culture, right? There, you might just be in a toxic or antagonistic culture and you have to be super aggressive to push things through. And that's unfortunate. I personally try to avoid those types of environments because my disposition, I don't thrive. I'm too sensitive. But the good news is you already have all those skills. So you can take all your designery skills, user research skills, and just turn them inward into the org and be like, okay, Sandra, she hates being surprised by new information in front of a group. I did that once and it made her really mad. Let me make sure before this group thing, I like meet quickly with her privately and tell her what I'm about to do, get her bought in. So then she's going to be a booster. Like when I do it, she's going to be like, awesome, I already knew, what are those weird little quirks with all of your colleagues that are driving their behavior? Just turn your anthropology hat inward on your colleagues, and that's part of what it would take to like build your organizational awareness and self-awareness, rather than being dogmatic about like, this is the correct process that we have to do.
Yeah, you mentioned something that was really interesting, which is like organizational awareness. But we spoke briefly before this about that designers focus on craft, execution, maybe presenting, but they don't really care too much about the politics that might exist and how to build organizational awareness. Can we talk about that for a sec? What do you mean by those like contrasts?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, one thing I'll say is politics exists in every org, whether we like it or not. I hate politics. And when I say politics, I mean like, what are the invisible dynamics that are shaping the behavior at work? What are the incentive structures that are driving behavior? And again, like use your research hat. Like you can turn your hat inward and start to kind of study this stuff. Understanding the funding structure of the business, the revenue model, how the company makes money, that will drive the behavior, at least of your senior executives. So if it's like an early stage startup, they're going to be very oriented around venture capital and what that means. And we can get into that if that's helpful, about like, what do funding cycles look like? Why is my founder getting crazy at the 12-month post-funding mark? It's because they have 6 months before the money is running out of the bank. They need to raise again, and you haven't hit your metrics, and they're pushing the team. So developing a sense of all of that stuff. I totally lost the question. This is when like 8 a.m. brain is coming in. I need more coffee.
Yeah, all good. Yeah, I need to sip some coffee as well. No, yeah, I think so. It was like, I guess if I were to rephrase it, it's like, why do you think, or like, is there any sort of intuition that why folks or why designers specifically don't like politics, or they don't focus on that versus something else?
Yeah. Okay, I'm going to do it, Chris. I'm going to write these things down because that'll help keep me on track. Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I hate politics in general, and sometimes politics can start to veer into really unhealthy stuff. It's like people are just empire building, or they're just trying to get promoted, and it's sort of about vanity or public facing recognition, or there's a lot of like bad incentives that are driving people's behavior that they'll never fess up to. They'll never be like, I'm empire building because I want to get the VP title because I think that looks sweet. So people are never going to fess up to that. And yeah, I mean, naturally, I think designers tend to be like anti-politics because I think it's a pretty like altruistic bunch. Like, and that was certainly me, like naively, in a great way. I think I was like, this is awesome. Like my whole livelihood is oriented around like how to serve people and how to do right by them. And whereas my cynical view of marketing at the time, I'm going to make some enemies here, spicy take, was like, marketing, like working in marketing, the product's already made, and then you just have to like hammer it, like hammer people with advertising to get them to buy the Pepsi or whatever. So that's a very cynical view of marketing, and marketing has like evolved a lot since those early days. But I was like, how cool is it that I get to be in a field that's pretty creative? I was a pretty artistic kid, and probably a lot of folks on the call were too. I get to do something that's creative, that's also pretty intellectual, and bring my curiosity. But it's all oriented around like, what does the customer need, and how do we shape a product around those needs? And so there is like an altruistic, empathetic bent to that. And so then once you're slammed into and maybe you're going into that sort of fresh green as a baby designer, and then once you slam into the reality of like the machine of like how things get made and how decisions get made within a company, it can be really like, I don't know. I think I felt a bit cynical about that for a time. But again, once I got into leadership, I was like, oh, you kind of have to do certain things this way. Like, sometimes like the whole like consensus to alignment thing, that shift had to happen. Otherwise, like no decision would ever get made. And I'm also a designer that like wants to ship stuff. Like I want to have an impact. And I've worked in places where I probably could have phoned it in and things never shipped, and strategy kept getting redone, and I'd get so jazzed about something and it just never see the light of day and just wipe the strategy, start all over. And that never felt good to me. Like I actually want a sense of rigor in my work, and I want to do great work, and I want stuff to ship because I want to have that impact. Or at the very least, I want to like test the hypothesis. I'm like, this is what we've been working on. We think this is going to happen when we put it out there. I want customers to finally get to play with it, to learn, like close that loop of learning.
Mm-hmm.
And it requires to have that sense of rigor that I personally want. It requires some of that structure that leadership is like navigating, that sometimes feels like, oh, why do we have to do this dumb thing, But it's like you have to, it's complex. Like try running a 10,000 person org with no process. It's going to be so chaotic and so frustrating as a designer because nothing will ever happen, and your like good talent will be wasted.
Yeah. What do you say to like maybe a person that a designer or a design executive that you're coaching, when they're like, it just seems like leadership are just scratching each other's back? Like,
Yeah.
does it even make sense? Like they're just like trading favors, and like, if you do this for me, I'll do it for you. Doesn't really make sense. How do you talk them down off that ledge that they're like, that hill they're gonna die on?
Oh, that's good. Maybe it is happening. Is that a bad thing? I guess it depends on the scenario. If it's toxic behavior, that's not okay. But if that's what their partnership looks like at that level, maybe there's some reality there. So I don't know. If you have specific examples for me where you're like, okay, here's an unhealthy example. Totally get that. Like if there's like trading budget and headcount just to like help each other out, that's, I don't know. Yeah. Do you have any examples?
Not off the top of my head. I've definitely probably like come across this. But I think I would say like it's quite, it's like a standard human behavior, right? If you help me, I'll help you. And sometimes it's not all like one-sided, like zero-sum game. So in that scenario, it depends exactly what you said, Sally, which is like, well, how toxic is it? And is it for the benefit of just these like siloed leaders versus a benefit for like the group and the longer term play? So that's, but no specific examples. But
I'm like, Dish, Chris, give me the gossip. What did you see? What did they do? Now what names?
Okay. So quick story from me. I was in an org where there was probably like when I was there, 12 designers that grew to like 25, 30-ish. And it was like my dream role. I was
great.
It was really good. And our manager was great. And she, we had, leadership meetings every week, and everybody was like super transparent, and everybody worked towards a common goal just within the design team, but also with our partners. And then I decided like, oh, I want to build the same thing somewhere else. So I want to lead the team. So when I went to this new organization, it was such a 180 turn. Like it was like people would only report good news.
I see. Okay, yeah.
Other leaders were saying like, yeah, Chris, love the new process, love the new thing you proposed. Turn around, nothing gets like done. The designers are still frustrated. So it was like, I think I saw a lot of that in terms of like, hey, when I ask for a favor, that doesn't get done. But when someone else asks, that does. What is that? Is that like me building trust? Like, so a lot of like traumatic experiences, I guess, that I've kind of shut down. Yeah.
That's so interesting. I mean, it sounds like there's a few things going on there. And isn't it interesting too that you're like, wow, we've got a really healthy functional team. Let's just take that model and plop it in here. And you're like, why isn't it working? So you were probably in the process of building some serious organizational awareness there, where you're like, oh, wow, this is a very different dynamic. Part of what you're describing, it sounds like maybe there is a culture where there's a lack of rigor around candid feedback, but there's a niceness culture. Like, I think sometimes companies get off track when they're like, it's such a nice culture, which I love. Again, I don't want to be in a toxic culture. I cannot withstand corporate bullying. That's happened to me several times. It was not fun. But I think sometimes companies mistake nice and kind. And well, Brene Brown says kind is clear, like giving clear, candid feedback about like what you need and what you could be doing better. That's actually the kind thing to do because it helps someone grow.
Mhm.
And if you're just being nice and surface level nice and it's kind of fake, people are just generally going to stagnate and the org isn't going to have that sense of rigor. And it's really hard. Like I'm not someone who is I'm naturally conflict avoidant. So to get to a place where I'm like giving tons of feedback all the time to peers, to folks who report to me, um, that's been a tough learning curve for me. But it's like the brave thing to do, where you're like the only way we're going to be able to like build great products. I think you could probably build mediocre products when you have a really avoidant culture where everyone's being nice and like maybe you won't dread going into work, but you'll have this sense of befuddlement about like why is it not? But it doesn't feel good. There's something that's missing.
Mm.
There's some spark that's not there, but everybody's nice. So I can't put my finger on any like toxic, you know?
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
and I think maybe I don't know, I'm kind of like spinning off here, but maybe we don't talk enough about rigor because
Mm.
it's not in style right now. It's more like great resignation. And what is the other one where you're kind of at work, but you're phoning it in? There's like a term for
Quiet
it.
quitting.
Quiet quitting. That's
Yeah.
more like the style right now. So maybe I'm like a not cool tech elder being like, but it feels good to like, I don't know. It feels good to be on a high performing team that gets along, that gives each other good, helpful feedback, helps each other grow. And you're like, we are shipping amazing stuff right now. It's so frustrating when you're like, we're phoning it in, we're shipping mediocre stuff. Just like spiritually, that doesn't feel good for me. But I don't know. I'm curious. Like, I'd be interested in the chat too. Like, if people are like, we don't want rigor, we want to phone it in. I can imagine that feeling good for like a month, but for a year, being like, this just doesn't feel nice. I'm not excited to go to work.
Yeah. Someone said, Judy said, nice is the same as fine. Like,
Fine.
yeah,
Yeah.
it's just fine. Like, this place is
It's fine.
fine. Yeah. It's
And
not
I would
bad.
take that over toxic. Like I've been in those
Yeah.
super toxic environments. People are fully throwing each other under the bus, lying, taking credit for your work, just all kinds of wacky. I can't make sense of that behavior at all because I'm like, these
Mm.
people are just monsters. Like, what are they having a private crisis and they're letting off steam at work? That's harder to make sense of, but at least it's more on the surface where you're like, okay,
Yeah.
that person's an absolute nightmare.
Yeah.
Obviously, we can all agree. And people are like, yes, nightmare.
I'm lucky enough never to be in a super toxic workplace, but I have been in this nice workplace where it felt a bit like the Truman Show, where it felt like I was
Mm,
like the only one, like I was going insane, but nobody else was, and I was like, "What's going on?" And it was like
yeah,
Groundhog Day where everything was on a loop, and it was just like, "Oh,
that's
it's
so
the
hard.
same day over and over. It's the same problem. We've learned
Yeah.
nothing," and it was just so eventually I went insane, didn't stay there for a year, and I was just like, I need to like, and I believe I'm still kind of like rubbing off on that. This was 2020 when I
Yeah.
quit, so
Yeah.
it's been 4 years,
Yeah.
but anyway.
Well, now you can bring that sense of rigor into your like creative solopreneur practice too.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I get to lead everything, and I get to decide if I
Mhm.
need to work or not, and it's all on me. So that's fun, and that's why I like
Yeah.
this journey. A couple of points before we get to the audience questions.
Yeah.
One thing that we spoke before is like to understand like your managing up and leadership from like an
Mhm.
IC. We should talk about promotions, things that
Yeah.
we
Yeah.
don't talk often about. So,
That's
Sally,
great.
why don't you start us off here? Like, peek behind the curtain. How how does like what do promotions look like, and what should designers know in order to navigate this kind of thing?
Okay, that's awesome because no one ever talks about this. Even like when you're at your company, you might be like, "Hey, how do promotions work?" And you just don't get good answers. Um, I kind of wanted to do a series of cartoons, like comics for LinkedIn, that are like, here's the conversation you had in your one-on-one, and here's what your manager's thinking. And it's like, how do promotions work? And you're in your manager's thought bubble. They're like, oh, beep, like I don't know, play it off. Oh, it's a great question. You know, we're iterating on the process. We really want to make sure it's equitable. And you're like, you didn't tell me anything. And it's like the manager's stalling because they're like, I don't know the answer. Um, but yeah, I love the question. And I will give like a super broad generalization, just like peek behind the curtain about how promotions work. It's different at every company. If you're at an early stage startup, they quite likely have zero process, and it's super biased and troublesome because they have no HR practice. So the more mature an org gets, the more process there is and should be behind it. So let's talk about a company that's got some pretty rigorous process for promotion. You've got your career ladders. Again, a lot of you probably don't have career ladders at your org. But let's say your company has a career ladder and you're senior, no, let's say like you're like mid-level trying to get to senior, because that's often like a top out spot where people are like, why can I not get to senior? And I often think that's because of a lack of organizational awareness and managing up. Like you're good on craft. And you're like, all my peers say I'm amazing and I'm doing great work. I don't get it. That should be enough. Why don't I get promoted? Either you're not managing up effectively, you lack organizational awareness, or your manager is ineffective, which is hard too. They might be actually like advocating for you, but they have no influence. So that's really hard. But let's say you're working towards senior, you look at the career ladders, you're working with your manager. Ideally, you want to be operating at that next level at senior for 6 months consistently. So the promotion is retroactive. It's an acknowledgement that, yes, consistently for the last 6 months, you're already performing at the senior level. You're not promoted on the promise that you're capable of it. You're promoted on the retroactive. You've demonstrated it consistently for 6 months. And you're using that career ladder to see like what's the difference between mid-level and senior, where I'm headed to. And I have techniques too for like how you can kind of work that ladder with your manager to identify the gaps. Especially if you've got like a green manager or an ineffective manager, you can kind of take control of that process to some degree. But let's say you've worked the ladder, you put together, your proposal, and your manager's like, yes, I agree. I think you should get promoted. Typically what happens is your manager actually has to put together like a written promotion packet on your behalf. And the bigger the company, it could be like a 6-page written document. It could be like quite, or longer. Like it's a ton. You are asking your manager to do a ton of work. This is not always the case. The benefit of the early stage startups is sometimes your manager can just be like, you got promoted. And you're like, oh, cool. Like sometimes you can benefit from just the chaos and lack of process. But again, there's also a lot of bias. But in the more formalized process, one, you've got to convince your manager that you're ready. So you've got to sell them on that idea. And then they need to write up the promotion packet to put forward during the promotion cycle. It's typically during like an end of year performance review. Sometimes it's not exactly synced up with performance reviews, but sometimes it is. And your manager then has to pitch your promotion to their manager. And so they might have to go in front of a room of their peers, like other design leaders, for example, or maybe their product partners, and pitch your promotion to their boss in front of their peers. And their peers already know about this person's work too. So they're like, I don't know, Sandra's pretty, she bullied this person, or maybe she didn't meet this deadline or whatever. So the fact that you're asking your manager to stand up and advocate on your behalf and fight for your promotion when you're not in the room. And so that's a big reason why managing up is so key, because you have to equip your manager with the information they need to make a case. It's like, imagine they're going to court, right? And they're like, I am advocating for this person's promotion. And if you've provided them with no information about what you've been up to, what you've delivered, how your partnerships are going, or if it's out of sync with what the other partners are saying, they need to make that case on your behalf. And depending on the nature of the culture, their peers might kind of push back and be like, what about this? They have to defend it in the room. The manager might be, it might be a challenging bar that they have to meet. So just wanted to like pull back the curtain there and let you know, your manager is quite likely going to have to go in front of a room full of people and fight for your promotion when you're not there. So you have to manage up, you have to share information, you have to proactively push information to your boss so they're equipped with what they need for evidence to advocate on your behalf.
Yeah. How do you, what do you tell designers when they're like, oh, I don't feel comfortable, like it feels like I have to always sell my manager. I always have to kind of like report back, and it makes them feel a bit icky. Like, it's like, oh, it's not natural. How do you like talk those folks down off the ledge?
Yeah, and you're right. There's nuance, right? There's nuance between bragging and being obnoxious in that way, like tooting your own horn for no reason. But hopefully, like understand that process, that helps you see that the manager needs to know what you're up to. And if it feels more comfortable, you can always like frame these things around like, here's how we're doing as a group, our triad, here's what we shipped, here's how it's performing with customers, here's our next step, here's where we're blocked. So you can phrase the story in terms of we, and hopefully your manager understands like you're owning the design portion of this we. But it's, I mean, and in fact, I think that's healthier, right? To be like, here's how things are going with my partners, here's what we're up to. Yeah, I need to think of a better way to think about what's the difference between bragging and giving your manager the information they need to be successful. Because again, part of managing up to is like being clear on what your manager is, what's their performance measured on, and what are they meant to deliver to the business, and how can your activities support that and align to that. So that should be like an explicit conversation that you have with your manager.
Yeah, exactly. Like if you don't understand the game you're playing, which is this career ladder providing evidence, then you're never gonna like climb up the ladder if that's the goal, right? If you're mid trying to go to senior. So that makes a ton of sense. Okay, let's address some audience questions, unless there's something you want to dive into, Sally. Anything else you want to add on this topic?
Yeah, one real quick thing. So when I mentioned earlier, like one way you can work the career ladders if you have them, if you're like, hey manager, one, I recommend if you're going to have a surprising question for your manager, where you can imagine that thought bubble where they're like, oh no, I don't know the answer, stall them. Give them a heads up asynchronously ahead of time in Slack and be like, hey, on Thursday when we have our one-on-one, I want to chat about how promotions work here, and separate your promotion conversation from the meta, how do promotions work at this company. Start with the how do promotions work. Let your manager know ahead of time so they can, if they don't know, if they're green or they just joined, they can try to get that information for you. And if they're green or just joined, it's okay for them to be like, I don't know, let me find that out for you. So first, just understand how promotions work. And then from there, if they don't have much in the way of support for you for like working in a structured way towards the promotion, one thing you could do is take a copy of the career ladders document. And I've done it almost in a spreadsheet where it's like, here's my level now, here's the next level I'm trying to get to. They kind of share the same facets, right? It's sort of like visual design, user research, product thinking, communication, storytelling, and like, where am I at now? What do I need to get to at the next level? And then maybe just give yourself like a self-assessment with like green, yellow, red dots. I just use emojis, and just kind of do a heat map of like, I feel like I'm, in terms of the next level, I'm good, 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 green, 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 yellow, need some work, red, I'm not doing that at all yet. And then share that with your manager, and well, tell them first, be like, this is what I want to do. I want to do a self-assessment, and I want to share it with you as a artifact we can talk through together. Does that sound okay? Because you don't want to be like taking over these processes for your manager, but get them to buy into it first, because they might be like, phew, thank you, you're taking work off my plate, so you're steering the process. Bring the self-assessment to your manager and go over it together. And if they're willing to do their own assessment and their own kind of scoring separately, and you can kind of compare, like, did we come up with the same heat map of where you need development, where the gaps are? Write notes in the notes section, like start to use it either to capture like plans for how you're going to close the gap, or build evidence. So it's like, for storytelling, I presented at the product all hands on March 3rd. I presented at the Inge all hands, blah, blah, blah. That's where you're collecting evidence as well. And one, it's helpful to compare, how did your self-assessment compare to your manager's? Because if your manager's like, I actually think you're green there, I actually think you're good, remember you did XYZ, write it in the evidence section, good. If you're like, I'm green, and your manager's like, you're red, that's so important to surface that, right? If your self-assessment, and again, we're working on self-awareness, if your self-assessment is a mismatch with your managers, either you need to provide more evidence to them and manage up more effectively, or just talk through that gap. And all of that becomes the basis for a professional development plan for the quarter. Maybe you utilize budget to kind of close that gap, and that's more evidence. And it becomes the basis of that really gnarly promotion packet that they have to write up. Like, as you're filling out evidence, once you hand them that, if they think you're all green and ready to go, hand them that artifact, and they're gonna be like, this is so helpful. Oh my gosh, thank you. This is like the starter for me writing that really gnarly packet. So all this stuff is like, you're building trust and credibility with your manager because you're having this really open dialogue, and you're finding ways to take work off their plate.
Yeah, really like that. That's really, really actionable. And it's it's an easy conversation to start. And also you guys can actually take that, like, start that conversation with your manager, and then start doing a self-assessment, right? Like, everybody can do a self-assessment, and hopefully there's a career ladder in some of the files at work somewhere. And if there
Yeah.
isn't, I mean, there are career ladders out there, right,
Yeah,
that you
that's
can
right.
help build with your manager and be like, does this
Mm-hmm.
make sense for our team, given our
Mm-hmm.
size, etc., right? But
That's a great idea.
having a clear plan, I think, really, really helps. Okay, let's go to this question. Let's start with Julie asked, Sally, love this. Organizational awareness. Exercise should be required step in onboarding process of all companies. Do you agree with this?
Mm.
This is not really a question, but do you think that it should be an onboarding process as a new employee?
It's interesting. This came up I was on Beyond UX, Jeremy Miller's
Yeah,
podcast, and we talked about this idea of like, man, you onboard into a new company, they make you do like Myers-Briggs or Strengths Finders or one of these other sort of DISC personality assessment profiles.
yeah.
Like, how cool would it be to do like a Myers-Briggs or DISC assessment for the org itself?
Mm.
I would love it if companies did that. Like, hey, we're going to help you make sense of what you're seeing here. In a way, onboarding, hopefully that if there is a structured onboarding process, that is happening. They're just not being explicit about it. So when I'm onboarding into a new org, I'm taking notes on stuff like that. I'm like, who are the executives? What's their background? How does this company make money? Who's on the board? If it's privately held, if it's a startup, who are the investors? Sometimes there's overlap between the board and the investors, like the lead investor of a round might sit on the board. Just taking in any of that kind of information that sometimes you only get during onboarding. So I'm taking crazy notes. Do it in a safe way that CorpSec agrees with. Don't do it on your private laptop. But take a ton of notes on that stuff there's a precious window, right? When you're onboarding where you can also ask those questions that first month or so. You can be like, wait, tell me again, tell me more about the leadership team. And getting a bit of the backstory on like, how new are all these leaders to the exec team? Like, when did they join? Where did they work before? All of that is like exposition for the journey you're about to go on. And I think it's super relevant. Even though, I mean, I think sometimes when onboarding in the past, I'd be like, this is so boring.
Yeah.
The values and work hard, play hard, same stuff every time. Like when I was IC, I was kind of cynical about it. I wish I'd been paying closer attention because there was actually a lot of good information there. Like, listen to what your CFO says in all hands meetings. Pay close attention to your CFO, C-level team, how they report on the health of the business. Try to find a way to like connect the dots between your work and the kind of things the CFO reports on.
Yeah, exactly. Let's go to this question. In my opinion, or this statement, in my opinion, getting promoted is more about building relationships with the managers than simply producing results. Disagree? Agree? Anything to add?
I think it's both. I mean, in a healthy org, like in an unhealthy org, if it's only about relationships and not results, there's something wrong with that org. But I think
Like a
I think it
family
needs to be
business
both.
or something? It's like,
Yeah, or like kind of like, yeah, if it's all just about like who you know and your relationships and like who owns information and how gossip moves and things like that, like that starts to feel pretty unhealthy to me. I tend to be more like results oriented, but I'm a very people centric leader. But if it's like, you could have a great relationship with me as a direct reports, but if you're not delivering results to a business, you're not going to get promoted. No, hard stop. And it's kind of heartbreaking for me actually, because I'm like, I really, really like this person. Like, they're awesome. And I take it on me. I'm like, it's my job as a leader to skill them up so they understand why they're blocked and like why they need to be delivering results. But like, it's sometimes worth going and looking at like the OG, maybe kind of douchey, but like business writers from back in the day, like read Peter Drucker, Effective Executive. Andy, I'm flaking on his name. That dude. There's the guys like IBM, or there's like really, really old books, like early 90s, or even Drucker is like probably 60s. He was like maybe the first one that was kind of describing the nature of a knowledge worker. And just all those, oh God, I'm stuck now on like who the Andy guys okay, in the chat, who's the OG guy that wrote books on like high output management or something like that? Andy, maybe he worked at IBM. This is so embarrassing.
high output management. Let me search it.
This is so bad. We're live.
Andrew Grove.
There you go. Andrew Grove. Maybe read his stuff. Maybe, I don't know. I can't speak to Andrew Grove. I know that Peter Drucker, there's not a single mention of a woman or anyone who's not a man. You know, it's all like he, him pronouns in all of the like scenarios he's describing. But that was the 60s probably. That was probably his reality. So also, if anybody has like a modern radical feminist take on the ideas that Peter Drucker is espousing. That's what we want. But those books have had an outsized influence on people who are now like older, you know, and like in senior exec positions.
Mm-hmm.
So when you hear me talking about like what's effective, you know, it's like I'm doing XYZ and it's not working. It's like, is it effective? Like that language comes from Peter Drucker and the Effective Executive, and using the term effective at work is the way to be effective at work, because senior leaders who are now in their 50s and 60s were probably reading Peter Drucker, you know, 30 years ago when they were starting their careers.
Yeah, slight anecdote from my side is that, so this question is like, or this statement at least is, getting promoted is more about building relationships with your managers than simply producing results. The reason why the Mongols invaded half of the world is because they didn't care about your family background and your relationship with the aristocrats. It was based on meritocracy. Anybody can move up the ranks based on how, let's just say, effective you are in battle, in
Wow.
engineering, in anything. So they actually created a system to like move people from like one country, you know, on the west of their empire to the east based on meritocracy. And you know,
Whoa.
engineers, medicine. So like that's also the reason why they're so successful in war. So like have that kind of baked in. Like it should be a meritocracy. Results really, really do matter. And yeah,
Yeah.
relationship is one element of that. But like if you don't do your job well, doesn't really matter, right? Like
Yeah.
whatever. Yeah. Anyway.
That's fascinating. I'll take book recommendations on that. I wanted to learn more about that history. That's so interesting.
Yeah, there's a really good podcast on this. I think it's like a 7-hour
Oh, cool.
podcast on the Mongols. I could share it
Nice.
afterwards. I can't remember,
Cool.
but yeah, it's really good. And the Mongols are like such a interesting time to like kind of study them. Okay,
Yeah.
here's another question about how to become a
You
best
too.
friend of your manager. Like how do you make them
Okay.
your best mate?
Yeah, yeah. Okay, good. Well, I like the spirit of the question. I don't think you have to be best friends. In fact, I don't even think you have to like your manager. You can be like, I don't care for this person personally. This is not a person I would spend time with outside of work, but you can still have an effective relationship. And why I like the spirit of it, if there's if there's two takeaways from this whole chat. One, save your energy. Like don't bang your head against the wall where you're trying to influence something where you just don't have influence. But two, probably more importantly, do not form an antagonistic relationship with your boss, because they hold your career in their hands. And that's just the reality. And it is a hierarchical relationship, fortunately or unfortunately. I don't know. Like, I don't have a value judgment on that. It is what it is. And there's also this like Chris and I were chatting earlier, like there's like a quadrant I have in my mind of like, are they a kind person or not a kind person? And like, are they effective or not effective, right? And so you might have a very kind manager who's not actually effective at the org. So they might put you up for promotion and they don't have any influence, and neither of you understand why it's like not working. So that's difficult in its own way. And then you also might have like a boss who's not very kind, who's ineffective. That's like the worst possible combination, right? It's like they're toxic, they can't get anything done, they can't help you out. But you can also have a boss that's like not very kind, or maybe just kind of don't vibe, but they're effective, and you can leverage that. You can be really like clever and savvy about that, and you can get along fine, right? It's like you can just kind of keep things surface. You don't need to be best buds, but as long as you're aligned on goals and helping them with their goals and vice versa, you can have a really effective partnership. But how to become a best friend with your manager, maybe how to have like a really solid, effective working relationship. Yeah, like avoiding being combative and antagonistic, again, just for the sake of dogma, and understand that they're a human too, and turn that empathy lens on your manager. Again, maybe I'm giving like uncool advice here. It's like they're humans too, but you know, maybe your manager has like a newborn, hasn't slept in 3 months, has a partner with a chronic health issue, just lost their father, like whatever. Like they've got a whole world happening too. Managers almost never bring that stuff to work. They hide a lot of that stuff in a way that like ICs can be more open and be like, here's what's up. Here's what I'm going through. But a lot of managers won't share that more personal stuff at work. And sometimes it's in the spirit of like servant leadership. It's like, it's not about me. I'm here to serve you. You don't need to hear about my stuff. You're not here to like support me. I've got my therapist and my partner for that. But yeah, they just understanding they've got their whole world, and they're also being measured they also have ways that their manager is assessing their performance. So if you want to have a really effective partnership with them, talk to them about like, what are your goals this quarter? What are your OKRs? How can I help support your OKRs? How can we create an OKR for me that's helping to like take a little work off your plate or clearly ladder up to support your OKRs? And just showing that spirit of generosity towards them, that you understand that they're like a whole human. I don't suggest though that you're like mining your manager for personal. I don't actually like that when ICs are like, what's going on in your life? Like I will divulge if I want to, but I've also had like direct reports that are really mining me for like really private, and it makes me like shut down. That's just me. Because I'm pretty open, but I don't want it to be like extracted from me in a way that feels really private.
Right. Okay, let's just do one more question if we can, Sally. Yeah. Do you have any advice on how experienced ICs at the lead or principal level could best communicate with their managers? I think we touched on a bunch of this stuff, especially concerning topics in which the experienced IC is more knowledgeable in.
Oh, that's interesting. This sounds like if it's not happening, like if your manager is not, if there's not effective communication happening with your manager, but you're the subject matter expert, especially because you're quite senior, to me, without more information, it speaks to maybe a lack of trust or lack of credibility. So what do you think, Chris? Like, but work on building trust, work on credibility. Definitely avoid like lecturing in a way that's patronizing, because that's not going to be effective. Nobody likes that.
Yeah, I mean, I think I would probably, sit my manager down and kind of try and solve whatever this problem that you're facing or this topic together, versus being like, no, I know this, trust me. Like that
Yeah,
never works, right?
nobody
I
likes
think,
that.
yeah, nobody likes that. So yeah, it's just have a frank conversation, and
Yeah.
you could also say things like, I would like to try this because of XYZ. Could I take lead on this? Could
Yeah, that's good.
kind of leveraging your relationship in the past and being like, hey, how, like, you could also test the trust between each other, right? By asking in this kind of way as well. But yeah, I think this would happen in all cases, right? Like the manager is not the all-seeing, all-knowing person,
Yeah.
right? They're
If
just
they are, that's scary. That's a scary place to be.
yeah, exactly. So this would happen, and yeah, this happen really often. So I think the first thing is to recognize that it always happen, but approach it in a way. Well, you know your manager best, but approach it in a way that's like, can we help solve this together? And also, if you are more knowledgeable and you're willing to take on the extra work, just take lead on it. Like a lot of managers will like applaud that and be like, oh, great proactiveness. Yes, please do this thing for me, because otherwise there's a problem on my plate, which I've got a million. So
Yes.
maybe something like that.
Yeah. And even like having the meta conversation about, hey, can you give me some feedback? Like how could I be more effective in my communication? I want to make sure we've got a trusted partnership. I want to make sure I'm bubbling up the right information at the right time. Make that an iterative process where you're bubbling information up the right way and ask for feedback on it. Because also some managers are really academic and it might come off as combative, but they really want to like interrogate something to make sure they understand it. So always having the meta conversation about the nature of the working relationship, as long as it's not toxic. That's always the caveat. That could be helpful too.
Yeah. Okay. I think that's a good place to leave it, because I know you have something like immediately after this. So before we let you go, do you have something to plug, share, or ask the audience? A PSA before we let you go, Sally?
Yeah, just give me a follow on LinkedIn. I post there sometimes. We were talking about I want to do more like cartooning and comics, like modern Dilbert or something.
Yes.
Radical feminist Dilbert. That's kind of the aspiration.
We want to see it. We want to see it. I know you got a lot on your plate, but yeah, I'll hold my breath for that one. So that's
Cool.
good.
Thanks.
Well, thank you again, Sally. This has been super
Thank you.
awesome. I know you have to run, so feel free to drop out, and I'll just finish up here. But yeah, thank you again. It was really, really awesome. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Chris. Thanks, everybody. Bye.
Bye. All right, guys, before we go here, just want to talk about our next event. Let me bring this up. So I will be speaking to Lena on December the 4th. I said this last time, but I mixed up the schedules. But he is coming on December the 4th. He's a PhD in digital game development. He's also the professor at University of Waterloo, where he is also their research chair. So we'll be diving into a bunch of user research stuff and what is it like to be a professor teaching students and anything you want to learn from him. So we'll have another Ask Me Anything like always. Again, I would like to share that we do, or UX Playbook, as in we, have a 40% discount this Black Friday, and it starts today. So you can scan that QR code or this one that I'm about to smash on screen to get resources and playbooks on how to build a better portfolio, step-by-step UX guides for any project, and courses to help you stand out in your job search, and even tactics and strategies to lead your first design team, things we were talking about today, right? So get 40% off with this code FRIYAY. If I can point to it, I cannot. FRIYAY24, scan that QR code or visit uxplaybook.org and enter code FRIYAY24. So before we go as well, if you want more conversations like the one we had today, then consider dropping a sub here. Ooh, I'm getting mixed up with my producing buttons, where you can sign up to this list, live.uxplaybook.org, and I will send you an email every time we're live so you don't miss these conversations, and you'll get notified twice a month only for future events. Okay, and that's everything from me. Again, don't miss out on this thing here. And I will see you next time. So let's cue that outro video. See you on December 4th. Bye. This is the design of everyday people. The design of everyday people.